March 15, 1928. Stephanie Street Clair vanished $20,000 in broad daylight. Every morning at exactly 9:47 a.m., Madam Queen would step out of her brownstone on 409 Edgecombe Avenue in Harlem, carrying nothing but a small leather purse and a folded newspaper. By 6:30 p.m., she would return to the same brownstone, still carrying the same purse and newspaper. But in those 8 hours and 43 minutes, $20,000 in cash had moved through Harlem's underground economy without leaving a single piece of evidence that could connect back to her. The Italian Mafia had been watching for months. The NYPD had planted undercover officers in her organization. Federal agents had followed her every step. None of them could figure out how she was doing it. None of them could crack the mathematical code that made Stephanie Street Clair the most successful illegal lottery operator in American history. But the secret wasn't magic. It was genius. Born in Guadeloupe in 1897, Stephanie Street Clair arrived in Harlem in 1912, speaking French and carrying a mind that worked like a calculating machine. While other immigrants struggled to find work in the factories and kitchens of New York, Stephanie saw something different in Harlem's streets. She saw mathematics. The numbers game was simple in concept. Players would bet on 3-digit numbers, hoping their choice would match the winning number drawn each day. The odds were 999 to 1, but the payout was only 600 to 1, giving the house a massive advantage. Most operators ran their games like gambling dens, keeping crude records, paying winners from daily receipts, and praying they could stay ahead of bad luck and police raids. Stephanie saw the fatal flaw in this approach. Records could be seized, cash could be confiscated, people could be followed. But mathematics? Mathematics lived in the mind, and the mind could never be raided. By 1925, Stephanie had built something unprecedented in the underworld: an invisible empire. Her numbers game operated on what she called the phantom ledger system. Every morning, her 37 runners would receive their territories and their codes. Not written codes, mental codes. Each runner memorized a specific mathematical formula that would tell them how much money they had collected, how much they owed in winnings, and how much profit they had generated, all without writing down a single number. The formula was elegant in its simplicity. Each bet amount was converted into a base 7 numerical system, then cross-referenced with the runner's personal multiplication table that changed daily based on the date. A $2 bet on number 419 might become green 7 morning in the runner's mental notes. The runner would remember green 7 morning until evening, when they would convert it back to dollars and cents using that day's formula. But the system was more sophisticated than simple code words. Each runner's territory was assigned a specific mathematical constant, a number derived from the geographic coordinates of their assigned street corners converted through Stephanie's base 7 system. Runner A, working the corner of 125th and Lenox, might have the constant 3.7. Runner B, working 135th and Amsterdam, might have 5.2. These constants were used to encode not just bet amounts, but customer information, payout schedules, and daily performance metrics. When a customer placed a $5 bet on number 823, the runner would perform a series of mental calculations. Convert $5 to base 7, 10 inches, base 7. Multiply by the runner's constant, 3.7. Add the sum of the number's digits, 8 plus 2 plus 3 equals 13. Divide by the day of the month, and convert the result back to base 10. The final number might be 47, which the runner would remember as Tuesday blue afternoon, using a memorization system that connected numbers to colors, days, and times. At the end of the day, the runner could reverse the process for every transaction, reconstructing the complete day's business from a list of seemingly random color-day-time combinations stored in memory. 37 runners, each carrying 50 to 100 such combinations in their heads, processing thousands of dollars in transactions without ever writing down a number. 37 runners, each handling an average of 200 bets per day. each memorizing their collections in a mathematical language that only they and Stephanie understood. 7,400 individual bets, processed daily without a single written record. But the real genius wasn't just avoiding written records. It was the collection system that made Stephanie untouchable. Every evening at exactly 5:15 p.m., Stephanie would begin her walk. Not a random walk. A precisely calculated route through Harlem that brought her past 17 specific locations. A barbershop on 125th Street, a flower cart on Lenox Avenue, a newsstand on 135th, a shoeshine station outside the Apollo Theater. To anyone watching, she was simply an elegant woman taking an evening stroll through her neighborhood. But at each location, mathematics was happening. The barbershop owner would be sweeping his front step. The number of dustpans he emptied would correspond to the hundreds digit of his runner's daily total. The flower cart vendor would be arranging roses. Red roses meant profits were up, white roses meant they were down, and the number of roses in the display indicated the exact amount. The newsstand owner would be stacking papers. The height of each stack communicated different runners' performances using a code based on the day's winning number. 17 stops. 17 mathematical communications. By the end of her walk, Stephanie had collected complete financial information from every corner of her empire without exchanging a single word about numbers, money, or gambling. The money itself moved through an equally sophisticated system. Stephanie had established accounts with 43 legitimate Harlem businesses: restaurants, beauty salons, tailors, grocery stores. Her runners would make their deposits by purchasing services and goods at precisely calculated amounts. A runner with $847 in collections might buy $300 worth of groceries, get a $200 haircut, purchase $247 in clothing, and have $100 in change held for later pickup. The businesses kept their standard percentage for providing the service, and the remaining money flowed into accounts that, on paper, showed nothing but normal commercial transactions. By 1928, Stephanie's daily operation was generating $20,000 in gross revenue, with $6,000 in daily profit after paying winners and operational costs. Every penny accounted for, every transaction disguised as legitimate commerce, every record existing only in the mathematical codes stored in human memory. The Italian mob couldn't understand it. They were used to dealing with operations that left paper trails, that required physical cash counting, that could be disrupted by capturing key locations or personnel. Stephanie's system was like trying to arrest a mathematical equation. Lucky Luciano himself sent representatives to Harlem in early 1929, demanding a meeting with the woman who was making more money than God without leaving fingerprints on a single dollar bill. The meeting took place at Small's Paradise on February 14th, 1929, with Stephanie arriving precisely on time, carrying her usual leather purse and folded newspaper. Luciano's lieutenant, a man named Vincent the Calculator Mangano, laid out the mob's position. You're making too much money to be operating independently. We want 40% of your action, plus access to your methods. We can protect you from police raids, provide muscle for collections, expand your territory. Stephanie listened politely, then replied in her French-accented English. Monsieur Mangano, you speak of protection from police raids, but how do you raid a system that exists only in mathematics? You speak of muscle for collections, but how do you strong-arm numbers that live in people's memories? You speak of expanding territory, but mathematics has no boundaries. She opened her purse and withdrew a single piece of paper with a mathematical equation written on it. This equation represents my entire operation. Every bet, every payout, every profit margin, every operational cost. If you can solve this equation, you can have 40% of my profits. If you cannot solve it, we have nothing more to discuss. Mangano stared at the equation for 10 minutes, then called in the mob's best accountants. None of them could make sense of it, because it wasn't just an equation. It was a code within a code within a code. The numbers on the paper represented not dollar amounts, but positions in a larger mathematical matrix that existed only in Stephanie's mind. Even if someone could solve the equation, they would only discover another layer of mathematical abstraction. It was like being given a single gear and being asked to understand a clock. Stephanie folded the paper and put it back in her purse. "Gentlemen, mathematics is not negotiable. Good evening." Mangano's face darkened. "Lady, you don't understand the situation you're in. This ain't Guadeloupe. This is New York. And in New York, everybody pays tribute to somebody. And who do you pay tribute to, Monsieur Mangano?" Stephanie asked, her French accent making the question sound almost innocent. "What kind of question is that?" "A mathematical one. If everyone pays tribute to someone above them, then somewhere in your organization, someone is paying tribute to mathematics. Stock prices, interest rates, profit margins, all mathematics. The only difference between us is that I acknowledge who the real boss is." She stood gracefully, smoothing her skirt. "You gentlemen spend your time intimidating people who are weaker than you. I spend my time solving problems that are more complex than I am. Which approach do you think builds a more sustainable business?" The meeting ended with Mangano throwing his whiskey glass against the wall after Stephanie left. But the mob's frustration with Stephanie reached a breaking point in the summer of 1929. If they couldn't buy her or intimidate her, they would try to destroy her through the legal system. Luciano had connections in the NYPD and the district attorney's office. Surely they could manufacture enough evidence to shut down her operation. Detective Ray Morrison of the NYPD's Vice Squad was tasked with building a case against Stephanie Street Clair. Morrison was considered the best numbers game investigator in the department. He had shut down 12 major operations in the past 3 years, always by following the same pattern: surveillance to identify key personnel, raids to seize records and cash, interrogation to flip low-level operators into informants. But after 6 months of investigating Stephanie's operation, Morrison had nothing. His surveillance reports read like fiction. Subject observed walking through neighborhood. No suspicious activity detected. His raid reports were embarrassing. No gambling materials found. No cash seized. No arrests made. His informant reports were useless. Subjects claim no knowledge of gambling operations. All interactions appear to be legitimate commercial transactions. Morrison's frustration led to obsession. He began studying mathematics, trying to understand how Stephanie might be using numbers to hide her operation. He interviewed professors at Columbia University, consulted with accountants, even brought in a cryptographer from the War Department. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Morrison's 8-year-old daughter was working on multiplication tables for school. She asked her father to help her memorize the 7 times table. As Morrison recited, 7 times 1 is 7. 7 times 2 is 14. 7 times 3 is 21. He suddenly understood. Base 7 mathematics. Stephanie was using a numerical system that most people had never heard of, let alone understood. Morrison spent the next month learning base 7 calculations, then returned to his surveillance reports with fresh eyes. The flower vendor's rose displays weren't random. They were base 7 number communications. The barbershop's dustpan counts weren't casual cleaning. They were mathematical messages. The newsstand's paper stacks weren't arbitrary organization. They were data transmission in a language that only Stephanie and her runners spoke. Morrison had cracked the communication system, but he still couldn't prove illegal gambling was taking place, because technically, it wasn't. Stephanie had created something even more sophisticated than the police realized. Her numbers game was actually a complex financial derivative system. Players weren't betting on random numbers. They were purchasing mathematical instruments that paid out based on predetermined algorithms tied to public data sources. Stock market closing prices, treasury bond yields, commodity futures prices. The three-digit winning numbers were simply mathematical results derived from legitimate financial data that anyone could verify in the next day's newspapers. Since the payouts were based on publicly available financial information rather than random draws, Stephanie could argue that her operation was sophisticated financial planning rather than illegal gambling. Her clients weren't gambling addicts. They were investors in a community-based financial cooperative that generated returns through mathematical analysis of market data. The legal implications were staggering. If Stephanie's operation was ruled legitimate, it would open the door for similar systems throughout the country. The case that would determine the future of the numbers game in America came to trial in March 1930. People v. Street. Clair would be remembered as one of the most unusual criminal proceedings in New York legal history. Not because of the charges, but because of the defense. Stephanie arrived at court each day carrying her leather purse and folded newspaper, dressed in perfectly tailored suits that reflected her status as Harlem's most successful businesswoman. Her legal team, led by attorney Samuel Battle, the first black police officer in New York, who had left the force to practice law, argued that their client was operating a legitimate financial service company that happened to use innovative mathematical methods. The prosecution's case seemed straightforward. District Attorney Thomas Dewey, later governor of New York and presidential candidate, argued that regardless of the mathematical complexity, Stephanie was running an illegal lottery. People gave her money, she promised to pay them back more money based on random chance, and she kept the difference. That was gambling, plain and simple. But when Stephanie took the stand, she transformed the courtroom into a mathematics classroom. "Your Honor," she said in her precise French-accented English, "I am not operating a gambling establishment. I am operating a community investment cooperative that uses advanced mathematical modeling to generate returns for our members." She spent the next 4 hours explaining her system in detail. Every bet was actually a purchase of shares in a daily investment pool. The pool's returns were calculated using mathematical formulas applied to publicly available financial data. Members could examine the formulas, verify the data sources, and calculate their own returns using the same mathematics. If a member purchases shares in pool 419, Stephanie explained, their return is calculated by taking the closing price of U.S. Steel stock, applying our base 7 conversion formula, cross-referencing the result with Treasury bond yields using our multiplication matrix, and determining the payout according to our published schedule. No randomness, no gambling, simply mathematics applied to financial data. District Attorney Dewey interrupted. "Your Honor, this is an elaborate smokescreen. The defendant is describing a lottery with extra steps." Stephanie turned to face Dewey directly. "Mr. Dewey, may I ask what you paid for your breakfast this morning?" "I object to this line of questioning," Dewey said. "Your Honor, I'm trying to establish the prosecutor's understanding of financial transactions," Stephanie said. Judge Seabury allowed the question. 75 cents. Dewey replied reluctantly. "And what did you receive in return?" "Eggs, bacon, coffee, toast." "Did you gamble on receiving those items? Or did you pay a predetermined price for predetermined goods?" "I paid for goods, but this is completely different." "Precisely. My members pay predetermined amounts for predetermined mathematical calculations applied to predetermined data sources, with predetermined payout schedules based on predetermined formulas. The only difference between your breakfast and my investment pool is that you can eat your transaction, while my members can spend theirs." The courtroom erupted in laughter. Even Judge Seabury smiled slightly. The judge, the jury, and even the prosecutors struggled to follow her explanations, but the mathematics were sound. Stephanie provided documentation showing that every winning number for the past 2 years could be calculated using her formulas and publicly available financial data. Her system was complex, but it was not random. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Expert witnesses testified about the difference between gambling and financial derivatives. Mathematics professors explained base 7 numerical systems. Financial analysts discussed the legitimacy of using stock market data to calculate investment returns. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a verdict that shocked the legal establishment. Not guilty. On all charges. Judge Samuel Seabury explained the decision. While the defendant's operation may violate the spirit of anti-gambling laws, it does not violate the letter of those laws. The prosecution has failed to prove that the defendant's payouts were based on random chance rather than mathematical calculations applied to verifiable data. The court cannot criminalize mathematical complexity. Stephanie Street Clair walked out of that courthouse as the only person in American history to be officially ruled not guilty of running a numbers game that everyone knew she was running. The aftermath of the trial changed everything. The Italian mob, which had been pressuring city officials to shut down Stephanie's operation, suddenly found themselves dealing with a legal precedent that protected mathematical complexity. If Stephanie's system was legal, similar operations could spring up throughout New York. But Stephanie had no interest in expanding her empire. She had proven her point. Mathematics was more powerful than muscle. Intelligence was more valuable than connections. And a brilliant mind could outmaneuver any opponent. In 1935, Stephanie began gradually reducing her operations. She sold her roots to trusted associates, transferred her business relationships to community leaders, and converted her mathematical empire into a network of legitimate businesses that continued to serve Harlem long after the numbers game was forgotten. Her final act of genius was the creation of what historians now call the Harlem Economic Development Trust. Using the millions of dollars she had generated through her numbers operation, Stephanie established a revolving loan fund that provided capital for Black-owned businesses throughout Harlem. The fund operated using the same mathematical principles that had made her numbers game successful. Complex calculations that generated steady returns while avoiding regulatory oversight. By 1940, the trust had funded over 200 businesses, from restaurants and beauty salons to construction companies and medical practices. The mathematical formulas that had once been used to calculate gambling payouts were now being used to calculate loan payments, business valuations, and investment returns for legitimate enterprises. Stephanie Street Clair died in December 1969. Leaving behind a Harlem that had been fundamentally changed by her mathematical genius. The neighborhood she had entered as a young immigrant speaking broken English had become a thriving economic center where Black-owned businesses generated millions of dollars in annual revenue using financial principles she had pioneered. But her most lasting legacy wasn't the businesses or the money. It was the proof that intelligence could triumph over intimidation. The secret math of the numbers game wasn't really about gambling at all. It was about creating economic opportunity in a community that had been systematically excluded from legitimate financial systems. When banks wouldn't make loans to Black entrepreneurs, Stephanie created an alternative banking system. When insurance companies wouldn't provide coverage for Black businesses, she created a risk-sharing cooperative. When investment firms wouldn't serve Black clients, she created a community-based investment pool. The $20,000 she collected daily wasn't just gambling revenue. It was venture capital for a community that had been denied access to traditional capital markets. The mathematical complexity that baffled police and prosecutors wasn't just criminal sophistication. It was financial innovation that wouldn't be widely understood or accepted for another 50 years. Modern financial derivatives, complex investment vehicles, and algorithmic trading systems all use principles that Stephanie Street Clair was applying in Harlem during the 1,920 seconds. Wall Street quants who use mathematical models to generate profits are following a path that she pioneered decades before computers made such calculations routine. The runners who memorized her mathematical codes went on to become accountants, business owners, and community leaders who applied those same analytical skills to legitimate enterprises. The businesses that participated in her money laundering network became the foundation of Harlem's commercial district. The customers who learned to understand her mathematical explanations became more sophisticated consumers who could navigate complex financial decisions. What made Stephanie's system revolutionary wasn't just its mathematical complexity, but its democratic approach to financial literacy. Unlike traditional banking, which required formal education and established credit, Stephanie's system taught ordinary people to think mathematically about money. A domestic worker who learned to calculate base 7 conversions for her numbers bets could apply the same analytical thinking to budgeting her household expenses. A porter who understood her daily multiplication constants could better evaluate loan terms and investment opportunities. The educational impact was profound. By 1930, Harlem had the highest rate of mathematical literacy of any community in America. Not because of schools or universities, but because thousands of people had learned advanced numerical concepts through participation in Stephanie's underground economy. They could perform complex calculations in their heads, understand statistical probability, and analyze financial risk skills that wouldn't be widely taught in public schools for another generation. More importantly, Stephanie's system proved that alternative economic structures could serve communities abandoned by mainstream finance. Her runners weren't just collecting gambling money. They were providing financial services in neighborhoods where banks wouldn't operate. They offered small loans, cashed paychecks, provided money transfers, and gave financial advice to customers who had been excluded from traditional banking. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, Harlem's economy remained remarkably stable compared to other urban communities. While banks failed and businesses closed throughout New York, the mathematical principles that governed Stephanie's operation had taught her community to diversify risk, maintain cash reserves, and create mutual support networks that could withstand economic shocks. Federal economists studying the Depression's impact were puzzled by Harlem's resilience. They attributed it to cultural factors and informal economic networks, without understanding that they were observing the results of sophisticated financial education delivered through an illegal lottery system. Stephanie Street Clair didn't just run a numbers game. She created a parallel financial system that served a community abandoned by mainstream economics. And she did it using nothing but mathematics, memory, and the unshakable belief that intelligence could overcome any obstacle. The leather purse and folded newspaper that she carried on her daily walks through Harlem weren't props in an elaborate deception. They were symbols of something more powerful than weapons or wealth. The tools of a mind that could turn numbers into freedom, calculations into community, and mathematics into justice. When federal agents finally gave up trying to penetrate her operation, one investigator wrote in his final report, "Subject has created a system so mathematically sophisticated that prosecuting it would require the government to criminalize advanced mathematics. Recommend case closure and policy review." That policy review never happened. Instead, the government chose to forget about Stephanie Street Clair, hoping that her methods would disappear with her. They were wrong. Today, every time a community creates an alternative economic system to serve people excluded by traditional banking, they are following Stephanie's example. Every time someone uses mathematical complexity to protect financial privacy, they are using her techniques. Every time intelligence triumphs over intimidation, her legacy lives on. The secret math of the numbers game was never really secret. It was just ahead of its time. And Stephanie Street Clair, the woman who collected $20,000 daily without leaving a trace, was the first person to prove that in America, the smartest person in the room doesn't have to be the richest or the most connected. They just have to be the smartest.